by tracing the evolution of moral elements in Sethe's pyramid texts. Breasted's commentaries put a somewhat optimistic spin on Berlin's usual attitudes. People of Ermin and Sethe's background were less malleable. The ancient Egyptians, Ermin had written in 1886, lived in a hard and monotonous landscape that had produced prosaic people and pale and formless gods, quite unlike those of the Greeks, who with their snow-capped mountains, their sea-foamed winds and flower-decked meadows had set joyous youthful deities on Mount Olympus. Winckelmann's late romantic vision had cleaved European visions of the past in half, into those cultures that had thrived before the perfections of the classical age, and those that had come after it. As to the cultures of those former ages, Winckelmann had long since concluded, those of the Persians, Phoenicians and the Egyptians had been lower than the Greeks, less civilized, more primitive. Even their bodies, Winckelmann observed, had been less finely made and were less noble, as were their laws, their customs and religions. It was a vision that had drawn on earlier Western images of a primitive world, in which humanity had lived in harmony with plants and animals, yet without the constraints or inhibitions of Christian civilization, chiming well with the rise of the Enlightenment and, latterly, evolutionary theorists, Darwin himself declaring that early humans had been as promiscuous as gorillas. The idea of the primitive as a dawnland, as mankind's childhood, as a universal stage in human development, offered a handy rationale for the European imperial ambition to lead such lower races towards the light. Later it would serve as explanation for such European disasters as the First World War, which could be counted as relapses, as slides back down the evolutionary ladder into temporary primitiveness. Throughout the 19th century, the notion of a primitive, lower stage of human development was extended to include virtually all cultures not of European descent, and aspects of those so-called primitive cultures, ancient and modern, had been scientifically classified and analyzed by a range of newly emerging academic disciplines that usually considered the subjects of their studies as subspecies in relation to European accomplishments, from their various physical attributes and languages, to their religions and their arts, their social structures, their histories and ethnicity. Many of these studies were undertaken by renowned academics who are regarded as the fathers of the modern social sciences. Distorted and politicized during the 1920s and 1930s, caricatures of that same vision provided a scientific pedigree to the students who burned on German books in the court of Berlin University, to those who chased Ermin's Jewish students into exile, and to the newly appointed professors of Egyptology, all products of the BerlinSeminars, who gave lectures at Göttingen and Leipzig dressed in Nazi uniform. As far as the creation of modern ancient Egypt is concerned, Ermin's vision of primitive pharaonic society had permeated the study of other areas of the culture as early as the 1890s, when many of his colleagues and students began to branch out from pure philology and undertake a series of pioneering studies in ancient Egyptian chronology, art history, and architecture. Reisner and Burchard, for example, both studied with Ermin, and they and their followers discussed the sublime architectures of Giza and Abusir and those of other ancient Egyptian sites in terms of magical and so-called primitive religion, employing as need arose terms extracted from early anthropological studies of the cultures of colonial India and Africa. In similar fashion, the assumption that the texts within the pyramids were products of a dawnland of primitive religion long served to isolate those dark columns of hieroglyphs from the living world that drew them. As Harold Hayes, one of the pyramid text's most acute commentators, recently observed, the agent and event are erased, and without them there is no human history. For history's sake, therefore, better to consider the pyramid texts at the moment when they were being cut onto the walls of pyramids, when they were part of the contemporary courtly activities of offering, sculpting and building. For there is no material evidence that they ever were intended to be the record of a national religion or theology, nor even of a book of prayer. Those acts of sculpting in the cramped darkness of a pyramid had encompassed something else again. Reading in the dark. You need a ladder and a torch today to read the column text within a pyramid. And as you walk from room to room, from corridor to corridor, their order is fragmented, dependent upon the placement of the verses, upon the light available and on the choice that every individual makes in their journey through those rooms and corridors. Nor were those texts set down in a predetermined order from pyramid to pyramid. No single reading, therefore, is definitive, nor is their arrangement logical, sequential or consistent. How, then, are they to be understood? Telltale marks of the sculptor's chisels and the correcting guidelines of the scribes who drew them out show many corrections, changes and mistakes. And that simple fact, along with the note that the scribes have occasionally inserted into those texts indicating that the exemplar from which a verse was being copied was either damaged or incomplete, shows that those scribes and craftsmen were adapting those columns of well-made formal hieroglyphs from exemplars written in a calligraphic hand on scrolls such as are shown in the hands of the images of priests that appear in the wall scenes of contemporary tomb chapels and temples. Recent text analyses, moreover, show that, contrary to the earlier assumptions of Maspero and Sethe, the verses within Venus Pyramid are not an editio princeps of those inscribed in later pyramids, that the oldest known examples of the pyramid texts are neither simpler nor less corrupted versions of those that were engraved in later pyramids, which, in turn, suggests that the texts in each individual pyramid have been extracted from elaborate, long-lost archives and taken to the pyramids in scrolls where they were recast into vertical columns of formal hieroglyphs, unlike the contemporary royal letters that were similarly recopied onto the walls of the nobles' tomb chapels in which report specific events. The texts within the pyramids do not report or hold a single linear narrative, nor, despite their vigorous rhetorical qualities, are they the scripts of the rites of pharaonic burial. Those noisy words are set down without a hint of guidance, direction or explanation, deriving from the shape and order of a distant, living world, their coherence I know largely lost. Certainly, like many of old Egypt's relics, the texts within the pyramids are residues of the activities and actions that had bound and, indeed, defined the living state, like the gestures of familial affection that were carefully reproduced in courtly statues, like the forms of pyramids and tombs. They encompass a variety of reactions, spontaneous and ritualized, to the act of dying, to the division of body and spirit and to the destiny of the dead on their journey from the houses of the living across the Nile and through the bankside reeds to the western desert and out into the living universe. They are intimations of realms outside the mundane, and, like music, acts of ritual slaughter in the smoke of incense. They aim to permeate and synchronize with the life-giving energies that were held within the valley of the lower Nile. Some of the verses of the pyramid texts are expressions of pure grief, as are certain texts and wall reliefs within the nobles' tomb chapels. Others, specifically some of those within the later pyramids, show that, in common with the developing order in the contemporary state bureaucracy, the roles of gods such as Re and Osiris were being elaborated and enlarged. Others, alternatively, hold formal words of offering and funeral. To that extent, they chime with something that Maspero and Sethe had both assumed. Yet the span and scope of the combined text is far larger than any such concerns, nothing less than multifaceted descriptions of the death and rebirth of kings in terms of the rhythms and energies held within the region of the ancient lower Nile, in its lunar and solar cycles, in procreation, in its bulls, its gods, its desert lions, and the rising of Sirius and its great wide river, within the fields of silt, the sprouting seed and the encroaching sand, in grasshoppers, fish and fowl, like the slaughterers of Abusir and the craftsmen builders of the royal Court, those who drew and engraved the signs and verses upon the walls of pyramids were penetrating the boundaries between the seen and unseen that had long since been established by that courtly culture. A culture in which the living and the dead, Pharaoh, his people and the gods were all sustained and vivified by acts of offering and building. Statewide and transubstantiate. 20. Look at us. Image and presentation. About 1,000 freestanding statues of the courtiers of the Memphite kings are known to have survived until today, along with fragments of several thousand more, 3 centuries of cheery bright-eyed faces that had once peered through the millennial darkness of their tomb chapels, and now greet us from under the spotlights of the world's museum cases. Faces from a time when there were few mirrors, no cameras and hardly any literature, when images of the self and others were different from those of today, when people lived within bubbles of personal interaction, when there was gossip but no news and most of the population of the lower Nile had lived and worked in farming settlements beside their great wide river, along with the explosion of reliefs and texts within the courtier's tomb chapels. The greater part of that glorious body of sculpture was a consequence of the increasing availability of copper in the times of the kings of Abusir and Saqqara. In those same times, as well, and unlike most of the sculptures and reliefs that were made during the era of the Giza kings, the patrons of many of these later works did not have a close relationship with Pharaoh. As a commentator of the last century observed, there has never been middle-class sculpture of such extraordinary quality in any other time in history. 80 years before, Mariette, who excavated large numbers of those noble statues, had thought them to be as chic as contemporary Parisians, washed for the best part with hot ochre pigments from the desert and mostly named and titled in lines of hieroglyphs engraved upon their bases, the archetypes of this riotous regiment of scribes and dwarfs, courtiers and princes, wives and daughters, were the sculptures made in the times of the Giza kings. This, not only in their splendid sculptural qualities, but also in their presence and their very bearing. The first known examples of the so-called scribe statue, for example, the famous pose of a seated cross-legged man with a papyrus spread open on his lap, was made, as many broken fragments have confirmed, as an image of senior male members of the royal household. Presently, the oldest known examples, inscribed with a cartouche of Khufu and the name of the royal prince Khalab, were found within that prince's Mastabo, which lies within the Great Pyramid's eastern cemetery, close to that of Hardiedev. Such works appear to tell us that these princes had mastered the arts of hieroglyphic writing, just as Hardiedev was reputed to have done, and the quality of the fragments of those early stony scribes is the equal of the sculptures of their kings, and they are clearly products of the royal workshops. In the following generations, the pose of the seated scribe that had originally been sculpted in a variety of hard desert stone was reproduced in the soft white limestones that were used for the majority of courtiers' statues. Following earlier examples made in the royal workshops, the eyes of some of these scribal statues were inlaid with shining stone, white alabaster mounted in copper set deep into the dry red painted limestone, so that the eye's orb seems to be alive and wet. Sometimes, a cornea-sized hole was drilled into the center of these alabaster inlays, and filled with a cylinder of highly polished clear rock crystal backed with a circular copper iris, with a small hole at its center to represent the pupil. The effect is startlingly real. Heads held high in the old royal pose, and with a slight smile of confidence seemingly playing on their lips. Those sculptures' shining eyes appear to follow you attentively around the room as if a scribe was poised to write and waiting for you to speak. An effect cleverly augmented by the sculptor's slight offsetting of the two bright eyes, adding to the illusion that they are in constant motion. At first glance, such tricks might seem more appropriate to waxwork sandstone sculpture. Here, however, they are a logical extension of the ancient craftsmen's obsession with filling their works with life. Those clear bright eyes setting the stone figure in that half zone between death and life, past and present. And so successful were those sculptures that, when Marriott's Saqqara workmen first opened up the mud brick massimo of the courtier Papyrus and revealed its now celebrated standing image of a middle-aged man, the near life-size wooden statue with its inlaid eyes had held such presence, such immediacy, that they had recognized it there and then as the village headman, their chic elbow dash, which is the name Papyrus statue bears to this day. Blackly bewigged and clad in fine white linens, the mass of courtiers. Statues are images of sturdy, well-proportioned people, some sensual, some as coldly formal as a diagram of an ideal human form, but all of them posed with heads aloft looking confidently forward, and each one with a quality of life. Sometimes, as in the great cache of statues that were set in the serdabs of the tomb chapel of the courtier Roar, the sculptors might carve 2 or even 3 images of the same subject side by side within the same stone block, Roar seated and standing in duplicate and triplicate. Alternatively, they could show their subjects at different stages of their life, from childhood into middle age, and mostly clothed though sometimes nude, with females portrayed as uniformly young and sheathed in the sheerest linens and mostly set in pair statues. Man and woman, though males are often shown at much larger sizes than their partners in such groups, the sexes still touch each other with the same soft electricity that is held in the gestures of Courtiers, sculptural companions. Occasionally, the sculptors rang surprising changes. The fond image of Sethe the dwarf, for example, its little legs crossed scribal style upon the standard block that often passes for a sculptured chair in such small-scale works, has 2 children standing side by side in front of Sethe's image, taking the places more usually held by the subject's 2 stout legs. Sethe himself sits smilingly beside his wife, who holds him as proudly as any of Courtiers' siltstone goddesses had held their king. In an entirely different mode, a splendid dark wood life-size statue, thought to represent Sethe has something of the air of cold command that one might expect today of high officials, and this despite the fact that both its inlaid eyes have been brutally hacked out. Whilst the grandest pieces of the noble's funerary ensemble, such as Nyaxkamet's huge false door and Sennacherib Inti's granite sarcophagus, were made as royal favors in the court's workshops, the majority of the noble statues appear to have been the products of the craftsmen who had built and decorated the courtiers' tombs. Here then, as the agreements that are recorded in some of those tomb chapels state, the households of the commissioning courtiers would have supported those of the sculptors. These independent craftsmen's studios may well account for slight differences in many of the sculptures' poses, in the diversity of their iconography and the different methods of sculpting. Some of the detail in the nobles' hands, heads and faces. Some of these idiosyncrasies, alternatively, may have resulted from dialogues between the craftsmen and their patrons, part of a continuing search that, if not necessarily concerned with modern notions of personality or portrait-like verisimilitude, might well reflect how nobles such as Khalab, Seneb and Sennacherib had wanted to appear. In a grand reversal of earlier practice, the noble sculpture sometimes appears to influence the products of the royal workshops. The sculptures of the Giza kings, which had been the models for many of the earlier nobles' works, had been made from big blocks of hard stone, which had greatly restricted their range of poses. The noble sculptures, on the other hand, were sometimes made from wood or soft white limestone. The limbs of Papyrus wooden statue, for example, move freely and openly in space and are constructed from several separate blocks all pegged together. Such lively images, it would appear, had served to free later royal sculpture from the strict forms imposed by the hard stone block, a change reflected in some of the later royal statues, in which, although they show the South Saqqara king seated on a throne in the usual way, the figure's limbs and other forms stand out freely from the stone. In those later ages the austerity of the earlier sculptures was transformed by a kind of mannerism in which the huge full forms of the Giza workshops were thinned down, the sculptures' waists snipped in, their eyes widened and enlarged. At the same time, this perhaps a tendency especially prevalent in provincial work, the surfaces of both the courtiers and the royal sculptures were treated in a different way. Those newly attenuated forms veiled in a kind of realism, within a live elastic skin. Then, too, the royal sculptors had largely abandoned working in hard desert stone in favor of softer and lighter materials, such as alabaster and copper sheet, which could be easily worked to attain such silky surfaces. And all the while, throughout the generations of that slowly developing tradition, the sculptors of both the kings and courtiers had worked with a small set of poses in the same strict rules of drawing and proportion, the craftsmen consciously and carefully maintaining such a close relationship to their way of working that the system was never garbled or modified. This was, quite simply, part of the visual language of a courtly culture concerned above all to transform images of the everyday into living aspects of an unseen world. For those great crowds of sculpture set within the darkness of the courtier's tomb, chapels had been made for people who well knew that, on their death, those sculptures would be lost from sight just as they themselves would be at death, but who had believed that their living presence would remain within the world, sight unseen. Ranks and titles. The last in that list of epigraphs encapsulates how the epithets and titles that were endlessly inscribed within the courtiers' tomb chapels and on their statues have been traditionally viewed, that they define the elements of a highly structured bureaucracy. Ever since Champollion's day, most Egyptologists have assumed that, from kings to farmers, Pharaoh's people had shared a traditional European understanding of class and had translated the courtiers' titles accordingly, as steps upon a social ladder that had represented the order of pharaonic society. And as the pharaonic state made mighty pyramids and was surely, as Gardner describes, one of the best organized civilizations that the world has ever seen, it is easy to assume that those same epithets and titles had indeed described the tasks allotted to the higher echelons of that remarkable organization. Yet whilst numerous inscriptions identify such workaday professions as sailors and potters, farm workers, goldsmiths and the like with straightforward simplicity, the courtiers' epithets and titles are so plentiful in number and so ambiguous in meaning that most of them have defied attempts to define any role they may have signified within the pharaonic hierarchy, that it is well nigh impossible today to discern the practical purposes of most of the courtiers' epithets and titles is due in part to the fact that the order of the state which they allegedly describe underwent several major changes. In the beginning, for example, in the times of the first pharaohs, the few titles that are recorded relate to Pharaoh's progress through the kingdom, when his close attendants had traveled with the king and held tithing courts in various locations along the lower Nile. And those same titles would be held by members of the king's immediate entourage some 3 millennia later. In the times of the colossal pyramids, however, those archaic processes of collection were reversed, and the produce of the lower Nile was being shipped to Memphis, and whilst the number of recorded courtly epithets and titles had considerably enlarged, most of them were still held by people close to the royal household, whose tombs still stand en echelon upon the Giza plateau. Even at this early stage of their development, just as those epithets and titles do not accurately describe physical relationship to the person of the king, so neither do they encompass occupations connected to the government's consuming task, the construction of mighty monuments. So with the possible exception of the royal prince Ankaf, whom a recently discovered papyrus describes as the overseer of an office controlling the delivery of building stone shipped to the Giza plateau, the tremendous tasks of constructing one of the Giza pyramids can only be described as a project organized by unidentified officials leading a nameless workforce. In the times of the kings of Abusir and Saqqara, when there were Major ongoing changes in both court supply and governance. The number of the courtiers' epithets and titles ballooned from less than 100 to well over 2,000. The diminution in the size of royal pyramids, the increase in the number of decorated tomb chapels, and the relocation of some of the courtiers' households away from Memphis and into the provinces might well have prompted this multiplication of epithets and titles, whilst the deployment of court officials into the provinces had distanced those courtiers from day-to-day contact with the royal residents and had probably transformed a simple face-to-face system of communication into a written chain of command. At all events, the inscriptions show that the few spare designations held by the earlier generations of courtiers had been overlaid, reign by reign, century by century, with a mass of other epithets and titles. Some of these had originated as antique phrases that may once have denoted roles and affiliations within the pharaoh's household. Others, alternatively, may have been honorific or bestowed as mortuary favors after death. Yet others still may have described a real function in pharaonic government or, perhaps, a single task successfully performed. In the past half-century, all of those epithets and titles have been subject to several close analyses. Yet the results have been so inconclusive that it is still impossible to know what most of them actually denoted, just as Sir Alan Gardner had observed in the last age. Before computerization, valiant attempts have been made to infuse life and reality into the titularies of which the tombs are so lavish, but the highly precarious nature of the results has to be admitted. So those grandiose Orientalist bureaucracies that we might well imagine had been directed by the holders of such translated titles as overseers of the royal documents of works of the treasury of the granaries are little more than mirages. Were the overseers of the royal documents, for example, librarians and archivists, or were they involved in day-to-day affairs? Had the overseers of works conceived and supervised the pyramids, or had they overseen the craftsmen's workshops and/or the kingdom's agriculture and canals? Had the overseers of the granaries controlled the tithing of the harvests and/or the storage silos? Had the overseers of the treasury managed the distribution of collected riches, or simply counted up the tithes? And then, of course, the meanings of many of these apparently straightforwardly translated titles, such as general and priest, had changed down through the millennia, just as have the tasks of the gentleman usher of the Black Rod of the House of Lords, a position presently occupied by a military man, a lieutenant general, companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, commander of the most excellent order of the British Empire, one time chairman of the National Children's Orchestra and Director General of the European Union Military Staff and the Council of the European Union. In similar fashion, the texts within the courtiers' tomb chapels suggest that they too had undertaken many different tasks, that they may have served the court at various times as diplomats, as priests, as captains of militia, as mine supervisors, sailors and accountants, as builders and as controllers of quarries, royal workshops and the temple's musicians as meteros, rather than that such tasks had been allotted to specialized professionals and ministries as in more modern governments. Some of the more permanent structures of government within the Memphite court, however, were revealed in the course of those painstaking analyses, along with hosts of other titles and epithets. For example, more than 80 courtiers over a span of 300 years are known to have borne the title of Shiadi, a term that is traditionally translated as Azir, a Turkish word that in the 19th century was attached to officials within the Ottoman Empire and at the Sublime Porte at Constantinople. Invariably, these pharaonic viziers had also borne another title, that of Uripet, one of those few titles that appear on the relics of the first pharaoh and were held by men close to pharaohs. Person down through the millennia. The post of vizier, however, first appears in the time of the colossal pyramids, when it was held exclusively by senior members of the royal household who were also entitled king's sons, an epithet that of itself does not necessarily imply that they were the physical offspring of the king. In those days, the title of vizier was paired with descriptive epithets such as he of the curtain or he of the door, implying that it had then denoted a chamberlain-like presence in royal audience. In later ages, alternatively, the title of vizier was borne by officials such as Senejime Binti, who were directly concerned with royal construction projects and who also appear to have been close to the king but were not members of the royal household and might well serve several monarchs in succession, and in their turn those viziers' households sometimes supplied a succession of viziers to the royal court. Adding to the general confusion, such viziers could also be entitled by terms that are traditionally translated as hereditary prince, chiropodist and butler. So the text within the enormous mass above the vizier Ptah that stands beside the pyramids of Abusir inform us that he had held the post of royal chiropodist, hairdresser and also provincial governor, and that he had married a king's daughter and served no less than 6 successive monarchs in a variety of roles, from a keeper of the royal diadem to the custodian of the secret, sacred writings of the words of the gods. Clearly, Vizier Ptah had long and lasting influence at the court of the Abusir kings and was a senior courtier, just as the title of vizier would imply. Yet the epithets and titles within his tomb chapel, that sonorous and scrambled mass of ambiguity, hardly amount to a history of the man or of his times. To pretend, for example, as some traditional historians have done, that Ptah had climbed up a ladder of success, and that he had owed his splendid vizier's monument to his physical relationship to Pharaoh as hairdresser and royal nail clipper is to fall victim to the illusion that Pharaoh's Egypt was a fairy tale version of a modern state in which Margaret the Thatcher had been appointed prime minister after the Queen had found her mending the roof of Buckingham Palace. In all likelihood, pharaonic society had been less socially aggressive and more integrated than most modern people might at first imagine. Ordering the kingdom, land and society. Life in the sheltered hothouse of the Lower Nile was one of the easiest in the Bronze Age world. Of farming culture, it was, essentially, a small-scale face-to-face society. A world in which scribes and courtiers had dealt directly with the minutiae of everyday, with erring servants, deliveries of materials and goods, and a work-day lost when the arrival of a pyramid gang's clothing ration had been delayed. Those same attitudes are equally apparent in the care with which the blocks of the 4 colossal pyramids were dressed and placed. Blocks whose production, as some of their graffiti show, had been the individual responsibility of small gangs of couriers and craftsmen. Ultimately, the Great Pyramid of Giza is a vast product of the labors of large numbers of those small gangs who cut its stones with integrity and care and set them as straight and true as the irrigation ditches in the Nile-side fields. Those small-sized gangs, however, were working in statewide coordination and under a consistent and masterful direction. So whilst the rural nature of that workforce is apparent in the qualities of each and every stone they laid, so the firm and subtle manner of the pharaonic administration is equally apparent in the Great Pyramid's astonishing accuracy and consistency over long years of construction. This, then, had been a state whose culture had not been founded on brute force or notions of national boundaries, but whose identity had flowed outwards from the royal residence, the courtly rituals, its building yards and craftsmen's workshops. And the fundamental order of the state was of its households, large and small. Just as the royal court was the nucleus around which the households of the Memphite courtiers revolved, so in their turn those courtly households were the nuclei of the households of a variety of craftsmen and scribes, servants and farmers, who were sometimes nude and pictured in the courtiers' tomb chapels, where they are regarded with a fond eye. And the households of the provincial courtiers of those times were modeled upon those of the court they served, to the extent that many of their tomb chapels had cemeteries of simpler graves, mostly shaft and pit tombs, laid out in the little deserts at the foot of the valley's cliffs in the manner of the Memphite cemeteries. These, it would appear, were the graves of the heads of smaller households, mostly farmers, some of whom appeared to have performed a role like that of village headmen. A post that in the late Old Kingdom was formally recognized by the officers of the court, just as the essential order of the living court is preserved within its cemeteries, so too that same order is apparent in the smaller cemeteries of farmers that lie beyond their fields in the lower slopes of the little Nile-side deserts. And like the tomb chapels of the contemporary courtiers and kings, the contents of those farmers' tombs also change through time, from the era of the Giza kings to those of the kings of Abusir and Saqqara. The sites that best show those changes underway were excavated during the first decades of the last century by George Reisner, whilst he also worked within the cemeteries and temples upon the Giza Plateau, set some 12 miles from Abydos, close to the modern village of Naga El-Dir and on the east bank of the river. These rural cemeteries are part of a continuous band of burial grounds of differing ages that run for miles along the edges of a wide silt plain whose bounteous crops of wheat and barley, lentils, beans and millet make it still one of the most fertile regions in the Nile Valley. In the time of the four colossal pyramids, most of the tombs at Naga El-Dir were but simple pits marked by mounds of sand and stone or rough-made mud brick walls, their placement echoing those of the Giza courtiers, with clusters of such graves grouped around a line of small mud brick mastabas. All these graves were anonymous and sparsely furnished, although the burial chamber of one of the brick mastabas contained a splendid diorite bowl of courtly workmanship engraved with Sneferu's name. This, Reisner suggested, was a royal gift to a village headman. The pattern here presumably reflects the settlements in which the dead had lived, where generations of a single household enjoying royal patronage had overseen a local population of farmers. The goods buried in the cemeteries of the following generations at Naga El-Dir reflect the changes in pharaonic society that were taking place after the construction of colossal pyramids had been abandoned. Whereas the earlier graves had held few objects, mostly brought from living households, these later burials held more goods and were generally of better quality, some of them containing jewelry and stamp seals that had been made especially for burial. At that same time, inscriptions carrying the names of the dead appear within these modest graveyards, names accompanied by simple descriptions such as overseer of herds, which suggests that their occupants may have played a role, for example, in the supply of cattle to the sun temples. By the times of the Saqqara kings, the names and titles of provincial governors and priests were engraved and painted on flakes of limestone that were left on graves within these little cemeteries, though not written in courtly hieroglyphs but in forms closer to the bureaucrats' workaday calligraphy. These modest texts bear witness, as do the courtiers' contemporary tomb chapels, to the increasing definition of the order of the kingdom, and in those later times, the grave furnishings of the people of Naga El-Dir were yet more generous, Reisner cataloging almost 500 amulets that had been placed within the burials. It would appear, therefore, that in the times of the kings of Abusir and Saqqara, the households who created the cemeteries of Naga El-Dir had herds and harvests sufficient to sustain the court and its extensive building programs and simultaneously support an increase in the size and the prosperity of their own communities, alive and dead. The decision of the Memphite court to diminish the size of the royal pyramids, therefore, had not only changed the rhythm, scope and culture of the court itself, but had also provided better lives for the communities that sustained it. Like the burials of the courtiers and kings, the graves at Naga El-Dir show a considerable concern for the well-being and continued maintenance of the dead, along with the thread of common culture, which, from the graves of the farmers to those of the kings, is found at every burial site in Egypt. Both Pharaoh and his subjects shared the prospect of a common destiny. It would appear, therefore, that the efficacy, the sheer power, of the courtly culture had been confirmed when the resources of the entire kingdom were exploited by the court, when huge quantities of materials and provisions were sent to Memphis from all along the kingdom, and thousands upon thousands of farmers had been brought together to build the royal pyramids, while setting skills amidst the general population that were neither typical nor indeed required for subsistence farming. That enterprise had shown the people of the lower Nile an order that was entirely different from those of rural households and communities. Yet the vast cooperative labors of pyramid making were not entirely foreign to the farmers of the lower Nile. Since prehistoric times, they had worked in groups to cut canals and maintain irrigation systems. Labors that must have cemented a sense of the power and value of community amongst the people of the farming settlements. To that extent at least, building pyramids had simply extended those communal activities to the furthest reaches of the kingdom and gathered them together at the court of Memphis. Pyramid building has been traditionally described as corvée labor, after a medieval system of forced labor in which peasants had worked unpaid in the fields of the local lord or had been conscripted by French courts of later ages for road making, a system which had been brutally adapted in the 19th century by the European masters of Egypt for the construction of the Suez Canal. There is no evidence, however, of that same cruel process operating in Old Kingdom times, nor is its application suggested by the intense precision and high levels of organization that were required for the construction of such monuments. For building pyramids and temples entailed the attentions of large numbers of skilled people working over decades with considerable concentration, qualities not readily associated with conscription and bullying coercion. Though the scenes within the courtiers' tomb chapels give glimpses of the tenor of the times, little is known of the social interaction between the court and the rest of the population. In later ages, the notion that the courtiers, at least, should conform to a closely defined code of behavior was attributed to the times of the Memphite kings of Giza and Abusir, and many lengthy texts describe that code in detail, although the instructions of Hardieff, which the ancient scribes regarded as one of the earliest of such documents, are largely lost. Several others from the era have survived. Gardner describes the prime virtues listed in these instructions, as all such texts are called, as consisting of obedience to fathers and superiors, the ability to keep silent in all circumstances, of employing tact and good manners in social intercourse, faithfulness in delivering messages, and a humility little short of subservience. Then, as the Vizier Chahotep, who is credited with compiling one of the longest of these texts, informs his son, "You will conquer like a crocodile," a sentiment that the elderly Sir Alan Gardner had heartily endorsed. There was as well a shared code of behavior outside the orbit of the Memphite court, a strong set of common values within households large and small and amongst a population of around 1 million people. Certainly, there was a wide diversity in the size of households along the lower Nile, from the estates and farming colonies of the kings and courtiers to holdings whose modest sizes are suggested by the smaller graves at Naga el-Dir. Yet, just as little is known about the intercourse between the people of those various estates and households large and small, so nothing whatever is known about the ownership of the land holdings that are recorded, nor of such concepts as leasehold, freehold, tenancy, and the rest were even part of the reality of the pharaonic state. Surveying and land measurement, marking out the areas of different farms upon those flat sill plains, had been subjects of tomb and temple relief since earliest times and were under the ultimate control of Pharaoh and the gods. Nor is that surprising, for field boundaries were liable to have been obscured by each successive flood. Yet in the times of the Memphite kings much of the floodplain remained uncultivated, which suggests that, rather than confirming the ownership of specific plots of land in a modern manner, pharaonic land surveys were concerned with the laying out of crops and irrigation schemes and, perhaps, in determining the projected size of individual harvests. Ultimately, of course, and as the texts insist, everything devolved to Pharaoh, although, in something of the manner of a feudal system, rights to the exploitation of various holdings passed down through generations of the same households. Rare surviving text record agreements, undertaken in front of witnesses for transactions such as the transferal of land use or the ceding of parts of a funerary estate to the cult of another dead person. As ever, what survives is often fragmented and usually ambiguous. The text, however, seem to show pharaonic society operating within a widely observed code of social obligation that had occasionally required a form of state arbitration and forms of punishment. This system was so broad-based, indeed, that it finds expression in some of the verses of the pyramid text, which insist that the dead king does not have to undergo such processes. Filled with the slow-burning ire of lengthy disputes, indignant letters addressed to individuals in the community of the ever-present dead display the living basis of that code of social conduct, the role of personal pledges, of household honor, precedence and possession. The court abroad. Nothing in the surviving record suggests that the era of the Memphite pharaohs was other than a time of peace, a time when the court had spent its surpluses on building pyramids and tombs and temples, and there had been no enemies. Nor, certainly, is there a trace within the tomb chapels, the temples or the archaeological record of a military caste or culture at the royal court, nor indeed in any other household in the kingdom. In consequence of this seeming passivity, ancient Egypt is frequently described as an isolated culture, by modern standards. Doubtless, that is true. The ancient world, however, was a relatively empty place, apart from the city-states set down along the Tigris and Euphrates. The populations of the contemporary Levantine cultures of Palestine, Syria, and Anatolia were tiny in comparison with those of Pharaoh's kingdom. Their courts small in size and number, frequently aggressive and usually short-lived. Nonetheless, there is considerable evidence of contact between those variously shifting cultures in the court of Memphis, interactions that were the direct successors of the ageless prehistoric traffic in such goods as lapis lazuli, amber and obsidian, which had connected such far-flung regions as the Baltic and Afghanistan, Mesopotamia and the Sudan. So it is hardly surprising that, as well as containing tiny fragments of exotica from such remote locations, some of the chambers in the nobles' mastabas of Giza and Saqqara also had quantities of Levantine pottery within them which had contained resins, wines and oils which, though they only grew in northern and more temperate zones, had been significant ingredients of the courtly culture of the Lower Nile since its beginnings. In similar fashion, many of the woods used for pharaonic furniture and boats, cedar, juniper, yew, box, cypress and hornbeam, were also imported from the north. Cedar wood especially, huge bulks cut from the ancient forests of the Lebanon, served as the major structural elements of pharaonic boats and barges, while cedar timbers were also used in tomb and temple construction and as the material of many architectural elements of state buildings, such as doorways and columns. Copper, the single essential material in the creation of pharaonic culture, had long since been imported from the mines and furnaces of southern Jordan, along the so-called King's Highway that ran down through those copper fields to the port of Aqaba on the northeastern Red Sea coast, from where it was shipped or sent in caravan to Memphis. Alternatively, another ancient land bridge linking the Levant to the Lower Nile, the so-called Way of Horus had followed the Lebanese coastline down along the eastern Mediterranean to the Nile's delta. This 500-mile trek was hardly suited to the transportation of heavy cargoes such as timber, so the bulk of that traffic was sent down the shipping lanes which ran parallel to that coast, from the Levantine ports into the Nile's delta, a week-long voyage which, in the best sailing season though in vessels lacking navigation aids, would have involved traveling by day and putting up each night in ports or on the seashore. These, then, were the two fixed routes by which many traditional imports from the Levant and regions further north, exotica such as lapis lazuli, silver and amber, had long been sent down into the region of the Lower Nile. In the times of the archaic kings and due in all probability to disturbances throughout those regions, there had been a cessation in that most ancient traffic. Those traditional imports begin to reappear in the archaeological record of the times of the Giza kings, and traffic grows again in the succeeding periods to the extent that some of the temple reliefs of Abusir showed foreign boats and their distinctive imports being carried into a royal audience, large oil jars whose shapes are well designed for stowing in the curving hulls of wooden vessels, live brown bears from Syria and quantities of animal skins, along with fruits and other fragile perishable goods that appear to have been widely exchanged throughout the Caucasus and the Levant but have left scant trace today for archaeologists. A major center of this millennial traffic was the ancient port of Byblos, in modern-day Lebanon, where French archaeologists have found warehouses stacked with locally made olive oil jars designed for shipping. Quantities of identical containers have also been excavated from the Giza Mastabas and from the glittering tomb chamber of Queen Hetepheres, a contemporary of Sneferu and Khufu, and in later ages, as the households of the courtiers moved out into the provinces, so too, as fragments of those same exotic storage jars in a single courtly text still testify, the imported goods that they had held were shipped to the provincial courts. By 2300 BC, when that text had been inscribed within any Saqqara tomb chapel, the courtly traffic between Byblos and the Memphite court that the much-traveled noble Ini obligingly describes was very well established. His text, however, is unique. Apart from this single recently recovered written record, only the far-flung physical remnants of that traffic have survived. Nor is there any evidence of the operation of a trade or bartering system. In exchange for such imports, the court of Pharaoh appears to have sent courtly goods and provisions to the courts of the Northlands, quantities of wheat and fine linens perhaps, now long lost, along with some of the more durable products of the Memphite workshops. At Byblos, for example, fine stone jars and round stone offering tables, bearing the names of Khufu, Hetepheres and several later kings, have been excavated from in and around the precinct of that port's largest temple, parts of whose architecture have a distinctly pharaonic air and were measured and laid out in Egyptian cubits. That some of those Memphite products named this temple, that of a local deity Balat Gabal. As the Lady of Byblos suggests that those fine-made items had been sent abroad as royal gifts to a goddess who, as a pharaonic sailing found within the temple shows, had been equated with the goddess Hathor. Similar courtly products, vessels of hard desert stone, gold and shining alabaster, have been found in excavations and settlements across the eastern Mediterranean and the Levant, from ancient Ugarit on the beautiful Syrian coastline by modern Latakia, to Crete and Palestine and Ebla, a considerable ancient city on the edge of the high Euphrates basin, and also to sites in Anatolia, where in the 1950s an illicit excavation recovered strips of gold which bore the name of the pharaoh Savour and appeared to have been attached to a box or palanquin made in the workshops of Abusir and sent off to the ruler of an unknown court. Nothing, however, suggests that these far-flung discoveries of the products of the Memphite workshops had amounted to a pharaonic foreign policy, as they have been traditionally described. Rather, they appear as part of an ageless traffic in delight and esoterica that ran right throughout the courts of the ancient Middle East, as tokens of respect and obligation between two courtly households engaged in ancient systems of exchange. Deserts, boats and donkeys, the great explorers. Besides importing copper ingots from the mines of Jordan and Palestine and places further north, the Memphite court operated large numbers of copper mines on its own account. Cut into the deep red rock of southwestern Sinai, a lengthy series of inscriptions and reliefs testifies to the millennial presence of Pharaoh's copper miners in that desolate region, where as well as smelting huge quantities of copper or close to their workings, they had mined the distinctive fine blue turquoise of the area. Both the eastern and western deserts of the Nile Valley had been similarly prospected, and they were not only mined sporadically for gold and copper ores but quarried also, for rare stone. So the great statue of Khafra al-Mahak had been cut for modeled nice ship from the Nubian desert, and most of Menkauri's statues were made of stony quarry deep in the eastern desert, whilst a large part of the alabaster worked in the royal workshops was taken from the desert quarries of Hatnub, near the modern Nile-side town of Malawi. Donkeys, boats and barges played key roles in this considerable traffic, and they are assets that are widely pictured in tomb chapels and temples and scenes of donkey herds, of seagoing ships and of huge barges with monolithic granite columns lashed to their decks. The most remarkable surviving element of these extensive transportation networks, and perhaps the rarest of all surviving relics from the times of the Memphite pharaohs, was discovered in 2008 on the bleak west coast of the Red Sea, some 90 miles south of the modern port of Suez at a site now known as the Wadi el-Jarf. Here lie the substantial ruins of an ancient port from the times of Khufu, with a man-made harbor and a 120-yard-long L-shaped mole built straight out from the beach into the sea. Close by that beach, Pierre Tallet and his team excavated and mapped 2 chandleries built from field stone, whose plans were similar to those of the magazines at Giza. Here, however, they were part filled with barnacled stone anchors from seagoing boats, 3 miles inland and cut deep into the low limestone ridge that runs along behind that coastline. 30 long caves which had served as the warehouses of the ancient port were opened by the French archaeologists. Inside, within that all-preserving desert dryness, were the remains of boat timbers and rope, along with huge quantities of globular water pots. Though previously denied, these discoveries proved beyond all doubt that, like those of their northern neighbors, the ships of the ancient pharaohs had also sailed upon the sea. 3 potteries had operated beside the warehouses, all of them producing those distinctive water pots. They appeared to have been made to hold the waters of a solitary spring that still rises in the desert a few miles inland and beyond the warehouses, at the lonely monastery of St. Paul. On that barren arid coast, this rare water source would surely have determined the port's location, supporting the 300-odd men that are estimated to have lived and worked within it, judging by the quantities of smashed ceramics found both in the settlement and in the shallow waters of the harbor. That same spring water had also been shipped 30 miles across the Red Sea to another desert settlement on the Sinai Peninsula, set in clear sight of the Wadi el-Jarf. This solid 144-foot wide circular stone enclosure, a unique structure for its time, had been set in dunes above the northern end of the beach of the El Marcaplain, a 5-mile-wide wash of sand and gravel that lies north of the oil fields of Abu Radais. Chips of turquoise and small globules of copper excavated from within that robust enclosure by its American discoverers suggest that it had served as a staging post and processing station for some of the copper ores and turquoise matrix that were being extracted from the mountains and the deserts behind the beach. At the same time, the enclosure may also have served as a stopping place and shelter for caravans carrying copper ingots across the wastes of Sinai from the mines of the Levant. Although, as the newfound port at the Wadi el-Jarf suggests, Levantine copper could also have been shipped by sea, directly from the Gulf of Aqaba to the west coast of the Red Sea. Tallet's discovery of sheets and fragments of inscribed papyri at the warehouses of the Wadi el-Jarf show that the port was part of the supply system which had supported and facilitated the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Written in practiced scribal hands and laid out in the manner of the later papyri found in the temples of Abusir, some of these Documents contain lists of produce and provisions brought from the Nile Delta and destined, presumably, for Memphis. Others, astonishingly, hold the day books of one Mur, an official of King Khufu's court in charge of 200 men. Over a period of several months, he had supervised the shipment of fine white limestone blocks to the work on Great Pyramid during the final phases of its construction. Apart from listing his various loads and voyages from the Tural quarries across the Nile to the Giza harbors, Mur's day books also record the checking of his cargoes on their arrival at the dockside offices of the Vizier Ankaf, a prince of the royal household who, like Hardieff, would be buried in one of Giza's splendid mastabas. That these day books describe work and supply at Giza rather than the port of Wadi el-Jarf where they were found suggests that Mur and his contemporaries had worked right across the state supply systems of the age and that the pharaonic transportation system had been highly integrated. The oldest known inscribed papyri to have survived from ancient Egypt, these unique documents hold the only known evidence, beyond the presence of the monuments themselves, of the extensive supply systems that enabled the construction of the colossal pyramids. An important added bonus from Wadi el-Jarf is that the ancient gangs had sealed the port's warehouses with enormous blocks of stone, some of which yet bear the names of Khufu's work gangs, that they had slid up against the open doorways of the warehouses on ramps of muddy shale and slats of cedar wood. This is the only hard evidence of the methods used by the Great Pyramid stone workers to move such vast stone blocks. The implications of the remarkable discoveries at the Wadi el-Jarf will reverberate for many years. Nor is that work complete. What is already clear, however, is that much of the copper used to make the chisels of the masons who worked on the Great Pyramid had been carried in caravan, along with the turquoise destined for the craftsmen of the royal court, from the mines in the Sinai Mountains down to the circular storehouse on the El Marca Plain, from where it was shipped to the port at Wadi el-Jarf. From there, the copper and turquoise would have been taken by donkey caravans on a month-long trek through the mountains of the eastern desert, along the Wadi Arba to the valley of Nile, where, once again, it was loaded onto ships sailing downstream to Giza and the royal workshops. That time was of the essence in building royal pyramids, both in regards to provisioning the workforce and finishing the pyramid within the lifetime of the king, is underlined by the fact that Khufu's immediate successors swiftly abandoned his port at Wadi el-Jarf for another which they established some 60 miles up the coast. Though this new location doubled the short sea voyage to the circular caravanserai on the El Marca Plain, it halved the month-long trek to the valley of the Nile up through the eastern mountains from the Wadi el-Jarf, enabling the caravans of copper and turquoise to take a shorter route to Memphis through the relatively flat landscapes along the route of the modern Cairo-Suez Road, and to deliver their loads directly to the royal workshops in the pyramid's construction sites. Like Khufu's port, this new dock and settlement was set close to a freshwater source, in this instance the hot springs that rise today beside the seaside resort of Ain Sukna. Rock inscriptions at the site dating from the times of Khafra and later show that this new port held potteries and also elaborate copper smelting facilities of its own, and that it remained a vital part of the state's support networks over the following 7 centuries, supplying both turquoise and the copper used by the court's craftsmen, masons and shipbuilders, along with the finds of ancient ropes, ship's timbers, oars and sail fragments lying as they were stored within another set of cave-cut warehouses. Evidence from later ages at the site suggests that the old kingdom's Red Sea boats, which were largely made from Levantine cedar wood, had been built in dockyards by the river Nile, then disassembled and transported, piece by piece to Ain Sukna, where they were reassembled on the beach. As at Wadi el-Jarf, these boats were sent to sea with cargoes of water collected from the nearby springs, along with supplies of food and the timbers of the ships themselves that had been carried from the valley of the lower Nile. These seagoing vessels were called Byblos boats by the Memphite scribes, and later examples of their unique design show that they would barely change throughout the following millennia. Unlike pharaonic stone-carrying barges, which could be huge constructions and accommodate enormous tonnages, the various representations of these Byblos boats along with their surviving timbers show that their beautifully shaped hulls had been some 70 feet in length and could have held cargoes of 15 tons. As their name suggests, these Byblos boats had also sailed upon the Mediterranean, voyages that are celebrated in the fragmentary reliefs of Savor's temples that show some of those elegant vessels at the dockside of a delta port, their sails furled, their masts lowered, as well as bringing the products of the Levant to Memphis in turquoise and copper from the Sinai. Byblos boats also plied the southern Red Sea coast, embarking in late autumn to take advantage of the local winds that blow up in the winter months. 2 such sailings are recorded in the Abusir temples, where they are described as voyages to the exotic land of Punt, or God's land as it was sometimes called. Temple reliefs from the times of Isaciansur show the presentation of some of Punt's matchless southern products at Pharaoh's court: gold and ebony, perfumed frankincense and myrrh, exotic pelts and sapling incense trees for the temple gardens of the lower Nile. Pharaoh's intrepid mariners had long since sailed the upper reaches of the Nile, though the cataract at Aswan had hampered their progress to the south, especially at the time of inundation, when a whitewater torrent tore through that granite gorge. Slipways were cut to bypass the cataract and enable the passage of river boats throughout the year, so that those ancient voyagers sailed to regions well beyond the Nubian quarries from which the stone of Khafre's celebrated state had been cut. Before the construction of the high dam, the names and titles of several Memphite scribes and courtiers could be seen on rocks above the great wide river beside the Nubian villages of Tumas, Tuska, and Abu Simbel, some 200 miles south of Aswan. About 200 miles further up river, at Buin, where there were riverine deposits of gold in abundant copper ores, a small mining settlement of the times of the Giza kings had smelted copper. Yet further upstream, close to El Dhaka and at the entrance of the Wadi Alaki, where there were rich gold deposits, yet more graffiti record the presence of 2 officials from the South Saqqara court who appeared to have been prospecting for rare metals, whilst other graffiti in those same southern regions tell of further expeditions ranging deep into the eastern deserts. Pharaonic caravans also traveled in the western desert, on such remarkably long journeys that their full extent has yet to be determined. Since the 1970s, desert archaeologists have been retracing some of these ancient trails that are still marked by cairns of rocks, by heaps of discarded water pots and the distinctive concave tracks that donkey hooves produce. Here, Pharaoh's caravanners would have encountered the peoples of the desert, those of the so-called Sheikh Mufta culture the successors of the Neolithic hunters who in earlier and more temperate millennia had raised herds of cattle and baked bread from the wild cereals of the Sahara. These pharaonic trails through the Sahara strike south and west from the 3 oases of Baria, Dakla, and Kergea, which lie in parallel 100 miles to the west of the Nile Valley and which in turn were joined both to each other and to the Nile's valley by webs of desert tracks. By the age of the South Saqqara kings, and probably in earlier times as well, Kergea Oasis, literally the outer and the one furthest from the valley of the Nile, held considerable pharaonic settlements, whose leading citizens lived in substantial household enclosures and were buried in large mud brick mastabas. The surviving records tell that the officials of those settlements had regarded the desert people, who, somewhat confusingly, have been traditionally translated as Libyans with a careful eye and kept a watch upon their movements. Like the mining expeditions to the Sinai, journeying south from these oases into the High Sahara was a considerable undertaking requiring planning, experience and skill. Before camels were introduced into the Saqqara in the first millennium BC, donkeys were the main beasts of burden in both the valley and the desert, having been domesticated in the first farming settlements within the lower Nile. Though they carry smaller loads than camels, donkeys are their equals in desert conditions. And mature animals in good condition can carry loads of up to 200 pounds and suffer only 30% dehydration, so that on a desert trek, those patient beasts will journey for 3 days without water before they die of thirst. In such extreme conditions the caravanners had to take considerable care of their animals, setting their loads precisely in with an even balance, loads that in great part consisted of soft water skins made from a single goat pelt, the contents of which could be decanted into the large ceramic jars when they were emptied of the other provisions that they had previously held. During those expeditions, the donkeys, in their turn, had been reliant on their drivers' understanding of the desert, on their knowledge of available sources of water and forage, and on their calculations of the amounts of sustenance they had to carry to ensure that man and beast came safely home. So the drivers had to ensure their donkeys' hooves did not split from the heat of the sand, and in summer, when daytime temperatures were intolerable, they traveled by night, navigating by the stars and from their memories of the outlines of the landscapes through which they passed. In such a way, Pharaoh's caravans could have traveled at walking speed for around 12 hours each day. Like that of the ancient sailors, the knowledge required to successfully complete such desert journeys is largely lost today, journeys undertaken by small bands of men driving large numbers of those gentle animals, just as the donkey drivers of the Sudanese and West African deserts do to this day. Rare inscriptions on one of the great stone outcrops that rise like sentinels out of the flat Sahara plain tell that, in Khufu's time, one of these desert expeditions was undertaken in order to obtain a rare desert ochre which the court craftsmen appear to have used as pigment for their paint. And in the shade of that high rock pillar, one of those ancient caravanners had cooked a pot of locusts on a desert hearth. Many such ancient encampments were set up by those rocky outcrops, and are still marked today upon the surface of the desert by the eggshell shapes of burnt brown storage jars half buried in the sand, just as the tracks ahead are marked by cairns and standing stones, by wind shelters and watchtowers. Named now as the Abu Balas Trail, the trail of the father of water pods. One of these tracks leads out from Dakhla Oasis some 250 miles south and west across the Sahara to the edges of the Great Sand Sea in the plateau of the Gilf Kebir, where another lengthy desert trek may well have passed through that lonely region of dunes and rock to a further oasis, from where lower Nubia and even the region of modern-day Chad would have been within striking distance. Following in the footsteps of the desert traveler Carlo Bergman, the discoverer of this long-lost route through the Sahara, since the 1980s, German archaeologists have mapped a chain of more than 20 ancient sites along the Abu Balas Trail, each of those staging posts at 2 or 3 days caravanning apart, and all of them sprinkled with sherds and clustered groups of ancient pottery made in the Dakhla Oasis, or the Nile Valley in the times of the Saqqara kings, set by rocky outcrops that provide a minimum of shade. Some of these way stations appear to have operated as miniature man-made oases. Some yet hold stores of ceramics that could have contained some 70 gallons of water and provisioned a caravan of 80 donkeys. Before the recent advent of desert tourism, many of those distinctive vessels had lain intact upon the desert. Other way stations, alternatively, held facilities for baking hundreds of loaves of bread, whilst the dry sands had also preserved donkey harnesses and baskets and numerous examples of the various ropes and knots that were as essential to the ancient donkey tackle and tethers as they were to Pharaoh's seagoing sailors. Such desert trails had served a variety of purposes over the millennia, judging from the splendid Neolithic rock drawings that have been found along the Abu Balas Trail. It was a route by which those ancient cattle herders had moved their stock north through the more temperate savanna of those times to water in the Egyptian oases. In the times of the Saqqara kings, alternatively, several tomb chapel inscriptions describe desert journeys which appear to have struck far further south and westwards, to the ranges of the Gabal Uwainat, where the borders of Libya, Egypt and the Sudan presently meet, and from that remote oasis, Pharaoh's donkey caravans may have journeyed further south again, into the region that the tomb chapel's texts call the land of Yam, as a text in the tomb chapel of the noble Harkhuf at Aswan appears to describe, though many of the regions named in Harkhuf's descriptions of his several southern journeys have not been identified, it seems likely that this great explorer from Aswan had traveled to the land of Yam along a trail that runs closer to the Nile than the high desert route of the Abu Balis Trail, a trail that is still well used today and known now as the Darb el-Arbin, the track of 40 days. Though the desert offers few human comforts, tracks such as the Darb el-Arbin are more direct than the routes that pass through the settlements along the valley of the Nile. And, as they are largely free of human settlement, they hold the great advantage of discretion. So, in the 1970s, Nubian camel drivers dressed in their white desert robes and carrying great silver-handled whips still run alongside their trotting herds up through these deserts to the Cairo markets. In medieval times, the Darb el-Arbin was traversed by caravans of thousands of camels and considerable numbers of slaves, along with cargoes of the same commodities as those that Yam's friendly rulers had presented to the courtier Harkhuf 3,000 years before. In his day, the Darb el-Arbin appears to have started at Asyut in Middle Egypt and passed through the oasis of Kargea on its way down to Yam in West Sudan. Harkhuf's expedition, however, had probably joined the well-worn track via a desert wadi close to his hometown of Aswan, where rock graffiti record the millennial comings and goings of just such desert travelers. The classical name of Elephantine Island at Aswan, indeed, is more likely to have derived from the term the Road of Ivory, the road, that is, that joins Aswan to the Darb el-Arbin, than the common modern observation that the shapes of its granite boulders resemble those of elephants, set high in the cliffs outside Aswan, always an ancient settlement of quarrymen and travelers rather than of farmers. The shadowed doorway of Harkhuf's tomb chapel is one of several similar punctuations, a series of shadowed rectangles, cut into a sandstone outcrop. Amongst numerous prayers and offering lists, several texts within those tomb chapels describe epic journeys undertaken by some of Aswan's leading citizens, who traveled as court officials both across the desert and also upon the sea to Byblos and other Levantine ports from the ports of Ain, Suqna and others in the Nile Delta. Such voyages were dangerous. 1. Tomb chapel inscription at Aswan records how an adventurer had retrieved the body of his father, who had been killed in the course of just such a journey, for burial in the land of Pharaoh. These were not military expeditions, however, simply trips undertaken with modest escorts that generally avoided hostile and ill-disposed communities and met friendly foreign rulers with gifts and courtly greetings. And in return, along with wood and copper, these travelers brought back to Pharaoh's kingdom ebony and ivory, and scents in the leopard skins that were worn by court priests. So highly regarded were the narratives of these traveling courtiers, that those lively texts founded a new literary form, one that describes the journey from the issuing of the royal warrant, the contact with other cultures, a description of a triumphant return laden with precious goods, and the traveler's subsequent honors and rewards at the hand of Pharaoh. Each text stresses the uniqueness of the journey it describes, the explorer's close relationship to his king and the gifts that they received on their return which, in Harkhuf's case, so his inscription tells, had included barges laden with date wine, cakes, bread, and beer, which had been sent out from the royal residence as the thirsty caravan had embarked on the voyage downstream to Memphis. A well-known example of Pharaoh's delight in these exotic outings is contained in a record of a royal letter that had been sent to Harkhuf by the young king Pepi II, in about the year 2380 BC, which was subsequently engraved on the facade of Harkuf's tomb chapel, a letter sealed by the king personally in year 2, on the 15th day of the 3rd month of the first season. This royal missive tells that Harkuf had already informed His Majesty that, along with the usual southern treasures, his expedition was bringing a dancing pygmy to the royal court from the land of the horizon dwellers. Now, dwarfs had lived within the royal residence since the times of the first kings, serving both as courtiers and retainers and also as providers of such entertainments as the gods' dances. So King Pepi's letter tells Harkuf to come sailing north to the residence at once. Bring him to me hale and healthy, he continues, and when he goes with you aboard the ship, assign able men to be around about him on deck lest he fall into the water. And when he sleeps at night, assign able men to sleep around his tent and inspect him 10 times over, for my majesty wishes to see this dwarf more than the products of Sinai or of Punt. And if the dancing pygmy arrives at court alive and well, the letter promises, the young king will give Harkuf rewards that will be remembered down through the generations, rich and richer, when he of Abidus. Despite the generally repetitive nature of the surviving text, and though all other sources offer but fleeting glances of life within the Memphite court, its scribes and craftsmen fashioned identities for several courtiers. Men like Hardiedev, Seneb, and Harkuf, that to the modern eye are more rounded than those of any of their kings. Yet the images of Seneb the dwarf and the lively text of expedition leaders such as Harkuf are hardly typical of the usual run of things, and the greater part of the courtiers' texts are formulaic and repetitive, so that, like the kings they served, they are little more than names. The career of one courtier and royal confidant, however, the Vizier Wani, stands as an exception to this generality, largely because of the sheer size of an inscription placed in his tomb chapel at Abidus, which describes incidents and adventures that had taken place during a long career within the royal household and state government, beautifully engraved upon enormous blocks of Tura limestone that are a little under 2 feet thick, some 10 feet long and 5 feet high. Breasted described Wani's 51 vertical columns of hieroglyphs, which are as finely cut as the contemporary pyramid texts, as the longest narrative inscription and the most important historical document from the Old Kingdom. Even Gardner, whose judgments were generally less sanguine than those of his old friend, considered the text to be an exception from the triviality, from the historical point of view, of most of the so-called autobiographical inscriptions belonging to the Old Kingdom. In fact, the text engraved upon those fine white stones describes Wani's 60-odd year career as a courtier during the reigns of Teti, Pepi, I and Mariner. Though filled with the stock phrases of most other so-called autobiographies of the day, it outlines a life so filled with incident and adventure that Gardner was left to wonder at the sheer energy of the man. Its story starts in Wani's youth when, in common with the children of other provincial governors, he was sent from his family home at Abidus to Memphis in the court of King Teti. Here, along with other young nobles, he began a lifetime service in relatively minor roles, performing many of the functions for the living king that some of his counterparts were undertaking in the royal temples of the time, where they washed, clothed and fed the royal statues every day. When he grew up within the palace, in the immediate circle of pharaohs' household rather than those of the officials of the state administration, the extent to which he had risen in royal estimation, so his inscription tells, is measured by the fact that King Teti's successor, Pepi I, charged him to undertake a discreet, not to say secret, inquiry alone, without any vizier or other state official, concerning an unnamed and therefore, perhaps, an erring and punished queen, the details of which are not described and which may or may not relate to other trials and tribulations within that court which Egyptologists have detected and reconstructed by interpreting the obliteration of the names of courtiers and their tomb chapels as state acts of punishment. Following this in-house inquisition, the inscription tells us, when he had served as a kind of military commander, when towards the end of a reign that lasted for almost half a century, Pepii charged him to recruit a body of men from both the kingdom and the Southlands, to undertake no less than 6 expeditions into the South Levant. At this point, the hieroglyphs upon the great stone stela burst into verse. Despite the grandiloquence of the translation, this is not a description of a war, like most ancient Egyptian accounts of expeditions to quarries, mines and regions outside the lower Nile. The poem stresses both the danger of the enterprise and also the safe return of the participants. Whilst the numbers of slain and captured and the damage done are, in the usual way of such inscriptions, considerably exaggerated. In a world where human existence was more fragile than today, it was hardly practical to lay bare great tracts of farmland or to exterminate the farmers. We may imagine, therefore, that when he had directed donkey caravans of men carrying large quantities of supplies into the deserts of North Sinai and the South Levant, where they had pursued and castigated sections of the indigenous population, who, as other adventurers describe, had probably attempted to block their further progress. Then, these caravans appear to have traveled further north, into regions with neither central control nor, certainly, standing armies. And they raided farms and took their figs and vines and destroyed some of the walled settlements that had lain along their route. Around 2310 BC, the elderly Pepii was buried in his pyramid, and the new king, Mariner, so the inscription tells, gave Weni a role in the governance of the kingdom, sending the middle-aged courtier, along with several of his contemporaries, back to the various southern provinces in which they had been born. One of these contemporaries, a certain Car, appears to have been charged with the collection of grain tithes from the region of the valley of the lower Nile. Weni, alternatively, was appointed to the newly created post of governor of that same region, from Aswan to Memphis. In which capacity, he tells us, he undertook a number of tasks connected with the construction of mariners' monuments. In Nubia he oversaw the quarrying of the desert stone from which mariners' sarcophagus and the capstone of his pyramid would be made, and the construction of cargo boats for their transportation. At Aswan he supervised the quarrying of blocks of granite for the royal temples, along with the excavation of 5 slipways to provide boats with a safe passage through the cataract. And at Hatnub, at the center of the kingdom, he oversaw the extraction of blocks of alabaster from the desert quarries, out of which a great offering table was to be constructed, and there, too, he attended to the construction of a 100-foot barge to transport that enormous stone. Such tasks echo the description of a favor which, Weni's text informs us, he had earlier requested of King Teddy I whilst he had served within the royal household, that at royal command, and in the same manner which many texts of the earlier courtiers describe, a sarcophagus and some choice elements of his tomb chapel's architecture should be cut from blocks of the finest limestone from the Tural quarries and designed and sculpted in the royal workshops. In following his appointment as governor of the Nile Valley, many fine white stones were indeed transported along with the unique blocks bearing Weni's long inscription, to the great plain of Abusir and installed within his enormous mud brick mastable which stood close to the monument of his father, on the broad desert that lies beyond the field. Weni appears to have built an imposing residence for his household at Abusir. As his lengthy text describes, his new position away from court appears to have been part of a late change within the order of the state, in which a parallel administration composed of men drawn from the households of provincial head men yet with strong personal connections to the royal house appears to have operated alongside the vizier's administration and controlled the supply of provisions and materials to the Memphite court. Weni, it appears, had died at a ripe old age in around 2390 BC at a time of national prosperity and increasing population, during the early years of the reign of Pepi II. As to the man himself, his prodigious tomb text paints him in the usual manner of such documents, as the perfect courtier with a lifelong and selfless devotion to the three kings that he served. Yet when he also appears to have been a man from relatively humble origins who had ended his career controlling the resources of a great part of the lower Nile Valley and with the personal means to build a lavish tomb on the desert plain of Abydos close to the burial grounds of the first pharaohs. As to his profession, he is best described, perhaps, as a tireless organizer of various royal labor forces, of desert caravans and labor gangs, recruited from all over the kingdom and beyond to undertake expeditions, to oversee work in desert quarries and to organize the transportation and shipping of the quarried blocks both to Memphis and to his tomb at Abydos. In truth, however, it is far from certain that when he had accompanied the various Levantine excursions that he had organized or, indeed, that he personally supervised any of the other enterprises which his text describes. For though that text is very long and filled with praise and place names, it is also packed with elusive and formulaic expressions, which, along with the present lack of understanding of the order and functioning of the contemporary pharaonic court, make it difficult to assimilate the governor's long career into a modern history. Best then, too, let the man describe himself in the last words of his great funerary text.